Hello, dear African Americans. Who's enslaving whom? Well, you might be tripping. In fact, the United States might be tripping on a lot of things. Or that's what the African Americans might be saying. Because of the causes of slavery, what's really happening and who's really purporting more violence among African Americans. I've already done a video on African violence, how the Africans were themselves involved in slavery, but I'm just going to take a peek at modern African enslavement. I'm going to look at Kenya, Nigeria, and Ethiopia, and then I'm going to add this onto this other piece. So let's come out of me, because I want this to be short. This is just taking a look at the landscape of slavery, modern slavery. This is the 18th century East Africa slave trade, human trafficking, and modern day slavery in Kenya. So there are several things that are here. Had tended to be a caste system in Africa, and they enslave other Africans. They still do it, and I guess it still exists in Islam. Just like we have slavery here, but it tends not to be based upon race anymore. It tends to be sex slavery. Let's come out of this. The descendants of slaves in Nigeria. This is a really good one. The descendants of slaves, this is from the New Yorker, Fight for Equality, July 11th, 2019, exactly a year ago. On a sunny morning in November 2018, 12 men and 2 women gathered in a lavishly furnished living room in Uguta, a town southeastern Nigeria, with air conditioned at full blast. Now, when you go through this, you will see how they are talking about slavery, how the British had to try to eradicate slavery in Nigeria. Nigeria did not actually make it illegal, I guess, until the 1960s. Domestic slavery, they used them for human sacrifice, all kinds of things. The Us were slaves owned by traditional deities. Adelia, who wanted a blessing such as a male child, a child was trying to avoid tribulation such as a poor harvest, or could give a slave or a family member to a shrine as an offering. A criminal could also seek refuge from punishment. And they still, many of them still don't have any rights. The abolition of slave trade in southeastern Nigeria. The British formally abolished slavery in Nigeria in the early 20th century and finally eradicated it in the late 1940s. But the descendants of slaves the Nigerians, the African Nigerians, did not make it illegal until decades later. But the descendants of slaves, who are also called Ahu and Usu, retained the stigma of their ancestors, and they are often forbidden from speaking during community meetings and not allowed to intermarry with the freeborn. Oh my goodness. These are other Africans against other Africans, tribes against tribes. All right, so please take a look at this article. Now we're going to go on. And they talk about killing people and all kinds of things going on. All right. I think it's important to look at this. This gentleman, the Lion of Judah, of course he was a lion. By the way, the Eager Lion movement and the Invictus Game movement used to have the same lion insignia. And the IM is, of course, one of the insignias for Mars, Aries, and also Satan. But anyway, Haile Selassie, he still had slavery going on. He did not let it go until towards the end of World War II. Even after his country had been invaded by Italy, he had slavery going on. They enslaved other people in Ethiopia. That's right. This is the great Lion of Judah, the freedom of the African people, enslaves other African people. You got it. European immigration. I should say immigration of East African was very little. And it didn't actually begin to pick up until they were free from colonialism. And then it was so violent, so very violent in Africa, that they had to try to immigrate into the United States. So I think it's important to go through, well, I wish we had seen it. Oh dear, that's not where we were. I forgot where we are. Well, let's go back. I can get back into it from here. Let's read it. There was very little that came into the United States because the East Africans were not part of the slave trade until 1965, and even then the numbers of African immigrants did not become significant until the late 20th century, when their immigration was spurred by violence. Now, the reason why I'm pointing this out is because of the Ethiopians and the Somalis and the Sudanese in the United States complaining about our great racism. Well, we weren't involved in their slave trade that they were very much involved in themselves. Since the African nationals achieved independence in the late 1950s to the 1970s, the continent has witnessed a recurrent internal ethnic conflict leading to massive human dislocation. By mid-1980s, most observers regarded the refugees crisis in Africa the world's worst. Now, what is the problem going on? They are fighting amongst themselves. They have always been fighting amongst themselves in the same way Europeans fought against themselves. They've only gotten better recently. And Native Americans were constantly fighting against each other. So there's nothing new here. Here's the Crown Prince of Ethiopia, the great philanthropist, who's here with Obama, with his Kenyan and his Indonesian people, because, oh, they're so wonderful, we're so miserable, and they need to cut into the United States. And neither Obama nor this gentleman were ever part of the American African or the Jamaican African movement. But boy, are they troublemakers. They do nothing but drum up trouble. This is great, explaining Ethiopia's long history of slavery. Just the first property, and then I'll add you on to the other part. For Hita Negus, the traditional legal code of Ethiopia officially enshrined slavery in the structure of Ethiopian society. In the early 20th century, this was years after the Americans abolished it, even though we still, Jim Crow laws and some lynching. But in the earliest 20th century, and I'm not minimizing this, in the earliest 20th century, Ethiopia had been between 2 and 4 million slaves out of a total population of about 11 million people. Let's repeat this again. In the earliest 20th century, Ethiopia had between 2 and 4 million slaves out of a total population of about 11 million people. You heard that one, right? I hope you did hear that one. Yes, okay. This huge proportion of the population were considered the property of their owners and deprived of any form of property ownership. You heard that, right? Yes, you did hear that, right? Okay. Slavery was so rife that Abba Jafar II, king of Jemma, an independent kingdom in Ethiopia with a slave-based economy, exchanged 2 slaves for 2 dogs and paid his dentist 5 slaves for a treatment. 2 slaves for 2 dogs and 5 slaves for his dental treatment. You did hear that. You did hear that. Somalian, Sudanese, Ethiopian. You do hear this. Kenyan. Oh, I hope you hear this. Okay, let's move on. Let's hear this. One reason for this continuation of slavery, Muhammad suggests, was warfare. The southward expansion of the Ethiopian state under the military campaigns of Menelik had created numerous prisoners of war. Well, that's always the case. Slavery reached its zenith in this period as thousands of prisoners were sold in slave markets. In other words, warfare resulted in the continuation of slavery in Ethiopia. Muhammad writes, constant warfare, I just skipped down. Constant warfare meant a constant need for weapons, Foreign traders were the only source of firearms and ammunition in Ethiopia. That's because Africa didn't modernize. They just, that's what they did. They slave trades for what they wanted instead of becoming peaceful. Why not? But these traders operated through coastal chiefs who collected taxes and tribute on many slaves. Many Ethiopian rulers, such as Menelik, tried to outlaw slavery, but were unwilling to interfere with anything that could disrupt the importation of firearms. There was so little pressure to stop the slave trade from the international community, Mohammed argues. There was also, he states that Britain, the champion of the transatlantic slave trade, as he described the country, had little desire to suppress slavery in Eastern Africa, and therefore did not get involved. Only when Ethiopia sought to join the League of Nations in 1923 did the real change occur. The League required Ethiopia to abolish slavery, but it didn't. It just didn't. Here we go. When we come down here, Tafari became Emperor Haile Selassie I and continued his program of abolishing slavery with the abolition of slavery in Ethiopia, the kingdom, but that did not happen until 1945. And it did not really happen until he was invaded. And nobody was willing to help him. And I'm not saying the Italians were good. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying, who's to blame? The British are blamed. Wrong for engaging in war and selling war things? Absolutely. But ultimately, who's to blame? Now let's add you on to the other part. This is actually an exercise that I'm doing for my fellow African Americans. Because if we're going to solve what's going on, and if some of you want to be repatriated into Africa, you have to go on and in with a firm understanding and with real leverage so that you're not bullied into some kind of submission. Because some of the people that are looking to go back into Africa are, and some women will sell you all kinds of things about going back in there. But there's a problem with child prostitution coming in. There's all kinds of problems. And if we're going to straighten out what's going on in this country, we have to ditch the problems that those other people did, many of them all by themselves before we even got there, they did it. And they were doing it even after we left. And we have to handle what's going on here. So with that, I'm going to be quiet. And you can say the same thing about Jewish people, or you can say the same thing about the only reason why I'm taking on the British, the Australians, and the New Zealanders is because if we free up that territory that's in Australia and bring it into North America, it frees up that land for the Chinese, and that gives a lot of global stability so that the Chinese are not marching through the rest of the world going into Africa. Because obviously, if you look at that little bit of area where 1.4 billion people live, something's got to give. We have the area, we're English speaking, we're part of the Five Eyes, and that's why, as a previous life, Elizabeth I, yep, I'm going to make that argument. We're going to bring it together. And I have real problems with what's going on in Africa, and I have real problems with our African Americans who came over as slaves. I don't want you to romanticize what's back there as they're the great victims. I don't want you to do that. And I want you to have eyes wide open when those people come into the country, and they're not helping us move forward. They're actually a hindrance because they're playing, well, actually that was one of the reasons why there was the Palm Beach County case. It wasn't the actual African Americans that I had a problem with. It was more like the Haitians that were so disruptive, and they would play the discriminatory African American. Sure, there were some African Americans, but the ones who were the most aggressive were the Haitians, who played the slavery card. Yeah. Be very careful, because we're being played. Okay. All right, so let's move out of this. And I'm not saying there isn't problems, but as a woman, there's lots of problems for women. And here we go.